and let me welcome you to the latest in our series of lectures, seminars to celebrate the work of our colleague Ewan Campbell. And today we're going to hear from Sharon Webb and Niall Sharples. And I want to, we'll begin with Sharon, and I just feel for some of you, it's, we should introduce her, but she's a very prominent figure, one of the leading figures really within the Scottish museum archaeology world, and she has kind of carved out that position through being a director and curator at the Kilmartin Museum since 2004. And it was a difficult time, and I certainly, at least I imagine I can remember Ewan's mood when he was a Kilmartin trustee at a period when he was showing real existential concern for the institution. And then it kind of shifted back to his normal positive, pessimistic outlook. And which, and that, I associate that kind of shift to Sharon's arrival. And it's under her leadership, the museum has grown significantly in terms of staff, in terms of volunteers. It has grown an Argyll-wide remit. It supports fieldwork. And somebody's mic's on. Anyway, most ambitiously, she's been directing a £6 million redevelopment project, which has gotten going, but as we're hearing earlier, she's almost finished emptying the building so she can, I guess, get the painters in, or whatever the next destructive phase is. She's written a book which I'm sure all of you have seen and found really useful, Footsteps of Kings, which is her guide to the Kilmartin area. And she's active on various national roles, trustee of the Society of Antiquaries and Carved Stone Committee and Strategic Archaeology Committee. So she's quite an important figure in terms of contributing to just the ongoing work of Scottish archaeology. And in 2015, she was awarded an MBE in the making.
Okay, wow, thank you very much, Stephen. I hopefully live up to that great introduction. And I will just start screen sharing with you now. Is that working okay for everyone? Yeah, okay. I think, I'm struggling a bit to get rid of the Zoom kind of banner at the top, but hopefully you'll just bear with me a little bit on and just ignore that. I'm sure you will do eventually. Get used to it.
It's okay. It's okay. It's within your desktop screen. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Stephen, and also thank you for Adrian for inviting me to speak. I feel a little bit like a fraud being here because this talk isn't going to be about early medieval Britain very much at all, really. But as Stephen said, it is going to be about a small independent museum in a wee corner of Scotland, and also a celebration of the contribution of Dr. Ewan Campbell to revealing, understanding and championing the archaeology of this special place. So small as Kilmartin might be, I'm sure most of you know this corner of Scotland is incredibly important historically and prehistorically. Just in case you don't know where we are, we're here about 70 miles away from Glasgow and about 30 miles south of Oban. So I can really only do, I can't really do justice to the extraordinary palimpsest of archaeological sites and monuments and the rich artefact assemblages we have here in half an hour. It is one of Scotland's most important archaeological landscapes, and the stories that this evidence tells are of international importance, and they're also relevant for the overall development of Scotland as a nation. So I'm going to skip merrily through about 8 to 10,000 years worth of history and archaeology as we know it, and then I'll give you a brief history of the museum and wrap up by telling you a little bit more about some of our plans for the future. And threaded all the way through this weft and warp of this place and this talk is Dr Campbell's considerable contribution as a trustee and advisor for more than 20 years. So most of you know the first striking thing about Kilmartin is just the sheer density of sites that we find here. When the museum first opened in 1997, our publicity proclaimed this extraordinary density to be 350 known archaeological sites within 6 miles of the village. But since then, the discoveries have just kept coming. Survey excavation work by the museum, by universities, by eminent archaeologists such as Ewan himself, Historic Environment Scotland, developer-funded archaeologists and foresters, members of the public. Ooh, that's just got something strange going on my screen there. That said, somebody's, can you see that, Stephen? There's red lines just appearing on my screen. It said Jill Boas. I
don't know how that happened.
No, I know Jill. She's in Oban. I think she's weaving something into.
I didn't touch anything. I've no idea what happened. Sorry.
No, that's quite bizarre. Don't worry. We'll just carry on.
Oh, excuse me. Someone has touched there up at the top under view option. There's a little tab that says annotate. And when you touch on that, it basically brings up like a little pin where things. And so everybody or somebody has accidentally touched their little annotate pin.
Wow.
That's what's causing the little.
Didn't even know it was there. I just moved my phone.
Okay, well, I don't know how to get rid of it actually. Maybe if I just click on the screen. Oh no, that's
hang on, I will go and see what.
Yeah, shouldn't worry too much. It's
I'll see if I can sort
it.
Okay, let's fingers crossed.
Yeah. So just going back to how many numbers of sites we've brought the total to, I think it's probably more than 800 now in this small area. It's a little bit wider than the 6 mile limit, but obviously there's more to discover all the time. And I think during lockdown I've gone for a number of walks, and I think I probably might have discovered maybe 2, possibly 3 possible Bronze Age cairns and a few more rock art sites to add to the total as well. So I kind of makes me nervous sometimes going out for walks, because it depends on whose ground you're walking. So the sheer density of sites is telling you that there's something extraordinary going on here, but of course it's more than that. So where does it all start? Well, we actually have very little Mesolithic evidence. We've got a couple of stray flints, including this core, which Alan Saville identified as Mesolithic, which was found on the shore at Duntroon Castle by a member of the public and awarded to the museum by treasure trove. But then in the early Neolithic, something extraordinary begins to happen. And I should say thank you to Erin Watson for this incredible reconstruction of the Upper Largy Cursus monument, and you'll see on the right hand side that's the Upper Largy Cursus aflame, which is what we think the archaeological evidence is telling us happened to that. Is it incredibly vivid reconstruction there from Erin, so thanks for letting me use that. And then also at Torflarren, this is the rock art site at Torflarren in Kilmartin Glen, which is one of the side glens just off Kilmartin, adjacent to the Glen. There's evidence that was found by Richard Tipping during the Andy Jones et al. Project a number of years ago, that was exploring rock art in Tuathlaren, and evidence of a very early cereal cultivation going on here. So we also have a number of chambered cairns. This is Netherlargy South, which is the largest and the most easily visited to property and care. Lovely site to go and visit. And also some of the amazing artifacts include round-based vessels like this pot from Netherlargy South chambered cairn. And because of lockdown, I was very lucky to be able to handle this. It belongs to the British Museum and they'd kindly loaned it to us, but weren't able to come and collect it. So I got a chance to handle it to help pack it up when it went back on its journey to London, and it did arrive safely, Alison, thankfully. Other artifacts have also been found in the Glen, including this carved stone ball, although not in a Neolithic context, I don't think, and also some lovely flint artifacts here as well. We've also got Templewood stone circles, which have a very complicated history, which I won't go into now. But this is the Northwest Circle, which started off as timber and then became stone. And Ewan was actually dug as a student. He tells me it was in the 1970s at Jack Scott's excavations at Templewood. And I managed to unearth these 3 photographs, but I'm kind of wondering if that's Ewan. I don't think it is, leaning nonchalantly against a standing stone. But if anybody can spot him, it's quite hard. I don't think he's there, but anyway, this just a reminder of the complexity of that site. And obviously, of course, that was work that helped us to understand that complexity, as well as reveal it. As I kind of wonder whether it put Ewan off prehistory, actually. You never know. And then also we have one of the densest proliferations of rock art of anywhere, Atlantic rock art. There's a particular type of rock art we have in mid Argyll, and it's one of the densest areas of activity in the whole British Isles. This is one of the carvings at Achnabrec, which shows up really well as in low levels of light as the sun's setting. And this again is one of Aaron's images of the Ormeg rock art site, which is photographs that he took at night. And there has been an awful lot more work on rock art in the past 15 years or so by Aaron, by Andy Jones, and also obviously Richard Bradley. And I think the Scrap Project has been running a series of seminars, and it's well worth watching Aaron's seminar on the origins of Achnabrec, which was a really interesting, and also just shows us how much more we can learn by studying these sites and by the use of new technology. So moving on in time, we also have some Chalcolithic activity. And this is one of 3 continental style beaker pots that were found in a grave at Upper Largy during the excavations in advance of gravel quarrying. And they're extraordinary pots. We could talk for hours about those, and I think you might want to invite Alison to come and talk at some point about them. The carbon dates came back as very early for beaker pots, and Alison's interpretation, which is holding, I think, is that these were this was the grave of an immigrant who'd originated in the as Holland, and this is one of the pots which Alison reconstructed. Absolutely gorgeous objects, but also incredibly insightful into the importance of Kilmartin during that time. In the early Bronze Age, the importance of Kilmartin as a centre for ritual and burial significance, should we say, is really seems to take off. We have an emergence, probably looks like there's an emergence of an elite who are using or expressing status and identity through the construction of massive burial cairns, and also the archaeology reveals their wide-ranging connections and contacts. This is the linear cemetery, which will be familiar to many of you. There's at least 5 cairns in the linear cemetery, and kind of tantalizing possibilities of 2 to 3 more, but also that shot, which I think I might be able to, shows the Canastery cairn, the white cairn, which is the top of that hill that's not been excavated. We also have on one of the stones at Templewood, and Kilmartin is one of the very few places, possibly the only place, where you get Atlantic rock art of the cup and ring mark style and megalithic art carved on monuments. And this motif here is the horn spiral at Acknabreck, which featured quite large in Aaron's talk. So I won't say any more about that, because you can go and watch his talk. Also, we have cup marks on well, oh, hang on a minute. I wonder if that actually is me doing that. Seems to be when I move my cursor. We have this grave slab from Netherlargy, North Ken, which has cup marks on it, but also the shape of flat axes carved and superimposed over the cup marks, which again is flat axes. Currently, the only other place where we found carvings of flat axes is at Stonehenge. So there's obviously something incredibly important in terms of the connectedness to these ritual centres going on in the Bronze Age at Kilmartin. We also have more Bronze Age activity going on at Templewood, beaker burial with 3 arrowheads that's actually on display in Glasgow, and you won't be able to go and see it, unfortunately, because the museum is closed. And also some of the most extraordinary pottery vessels, some of the finest pottery to Scottish Bronze Age pottery has been found in Kilmartin Glen. And this pot, I think, sums up quite a lot of the themes that's going on in the Bronze Age in Kilmartin. It's the upper largy-footed food vessel. So its body is Irish in style and decoration, and it has 4 little stumpy feet, which is an Irish trait. So we have these lots of the connections with artifacts and materials kind of embodied in one vessel. And also some of the other things that has the Yorkshire influence, of course, is the Whitby jet spacer plate necklaces. This is the one that belongs to the National Museum of Scotland from a kiss grave in Portallach. But the Glebe cairn contained another fragments of a spacer plate necklace, which sadly has been lost. Also in Kilmartin, you generally in the summer find loads of kids running around having fun with standing stones. This is the Lady Glastonbury's cup marks standing stone row, which we have 2 stone rows, the Ballymenoch stone row and this one. The dating is a little bit uncertain of these, but I think there's a carbon date from one of the a socket from one of the Ballymenoch stones, which came back as towards the end or the middle to late Bronze Age. So coming to the end of this kind of extraordinary explosion of monumentality in Kilmartin. And then just moving on into the Iron Age. Sorry, this is a terrible slide of a map of the Fortsdoons, Cranogso, and Brochs, obviously, because it includes the north of Argyll. The distribution of Iron Age fortified settlement sites, of which there is a considerable number. And then obviously moving on, we have Dunad, and I'm not going to say very much to this esteemed audience about that site, especially Ewan is here. But I think suffice to say the significance of the prehistoric landscape at Kilmartin wasn't lost on the later peoples, and I think it's no accident that the people of Doriada chose to site their capital here. And as I think you'll all know about Ewan and Alan Lane's incredible work on this site in the 1980s, and the subsequent publication, I think, still stands as the seminal work on not only on Dunad, but also on probably the whole period for this part of Argyll. And also, as you know, Ewan's been responsible for writing up some of the other early medieval sites that have been found in the area, and is also kindly helping us to write up some of the excavation work that the museum has undertaken. Also need to mention the early Christian activity in the Glen. We have an extraordinary density of Kill place names, but also a fantastic collection of carved grave slabs and crosses from a range of periods across the medieval period in Kilmartin. These are two crosses that are actually in Kilmartin Church, that are in the care of Historic Environment Scotland. So I guess it's pretty easy to see why some sort of interpretation centre was required or needed in Kilmartin. So the museum itself was founded by David Clough and Rachel Butter, and the trust was established in 1992. And then after a huge amount of effort and volunteer support and volunteer energy, the museum opened in 97. It was incredibly well received at the time. It won prestigious awards for its innovative and emotive exhibition and audiovisual show, which many of you will have visited. Ewan was involved in the founding of the museum, although he wasn't a trustee at the time, and he advised on all aspects, but obviously in particular on the exhibition of the Dunad area. And I think so often the relationship between archaeologists who've worked within a local community, the relationship is quite often very brief, but obviously this hasn't been the case with Ewan. He's cultivated a long-term relationship and a connection with the community he worked in at Dunad through the museum. And obviously this has been hugely beneficial to us. I hope he's enjoyed it. From what you said, Stephen, he wasn't coming back with huge joyful expressions about the museum at some of the times, but I do hope he has enjoyed some of the things he's done for us. The museum's a charity, and as Stephen touched on, the aim when it was initially set up was that it would be completely self-supporting through earned income. This didn't happen, and I don't think it's any surprise really, because I think running any business on the west coast of Scotland is tricky enough, but let alone a cultural organisation. So after crises, the last one of which I was involved in, we have reached a relatively stable platform in terms of funding, and that's been the case for many years now. We're part funded by Historic Environment Scotland and Argyll and Bute Council in terms of revenue, and before COVID hit we were raising about half of what we needed to run ourselves through music ticket sales, the cafe and retail. I think it's a massive achievement, but I think it's in no small part down to the efforts of a group of people who set up the museum in the 90s, and Ewan is one of them. So I came here, I think it was actually 2003 as curator, and became the director and curator in 2004. Ewan became a trustee in 1994. I don't think that's a picture from 94. I think that's a little bit later, given the other individuals. it always slightly amuses me, this picture, because we didn't tell the trustees they had to wear a uniform, but they've just kind of fallen into it themselves. He has kept us on the right track for focusing on cultural aspects, and I've always found him a huge support. And also he brought on other very talented people as well, like Dr Sally Foster, who's also been a brilliant trustee. So by about 2010, it was apparent that we had outgrown our work. We had the site had outgrown our work, and we couldn't fulfil the potential of the local archaeology or the collections. And actually, we were struggling to curate what we had. The museum collection had grown from a really small founding collection to us having over 20,000 artifacts in our own collection, and in 2019, just over half of these were recognised as nationally significant by Museums Gallery Scotland. Again, a huge achievement. We became the 50th recognised collection then. And we also curate about 20,000 artifacts that belong to Argyll and Bute Council under a service level agreement. And this includes lots of medieval sculpture, excavation archives, pottery from and jet from the Beerha Chambered Cairn, and also from Blast Hill, Vicky Cummins' Blast Hill recent excavations. So you can see why we might have needed a bit more space. And in 2012, we embarked on a project that we hope would build on our successes and give us the infrastructure we needed to continue to develop our work. I won't go into too much now about how we got where we are now, but suffice to say, it's been a long, challenging journey that's involved blood, sweat and tears on more than one occasion. But from the very first Blue Skies meetings, Ewan's been involved, quietly advising and helping make sure that the whole team has kept the fact that we're an archaeological museum first and foremost. The project has developed in terms of the architecture, interpretation and education elements. And some of the things that have helped us along the way were the symposium that we held to map out the state of archaeological knowledge for Argyll's archaeology, which then developed into the regional archaeological research framework for Argyll. And this was the first regional research framework in Scotland, and obviously more have come online since then, as the Society of Antiquaries has been obviously playing a huge role in pushing this forward. Ewan obviously played a significant role in the Argyll research framework, and he, with Colleen Beattie, wrote the early medieval Argyll, Norse and Viking Argyll section, which is still available online and still really is the kind of seminal work on that period for this particular area. He's also had a hand in helping us to develop what our story actually was in the new museum. He's given us advice on Gaelic language and how we handle this in the exhibition, as well as on the early medieval history and everything else, to be honest. Erin and I were recently recalling one of the significant seminars that we held in Edinburgh in 2018, when you could do such a thing, when we were scoping out what was important about the archaeology of Kilmartin Glen. We listened to you and give the most incredible, succinct summary of the importance of Dunad, which he did pretty much without pausing for breath. I wish I'd recorded it, but I did scribble it all down, and that scrap of paper pretty much has formed the summary for the key messages that we've been developing for the Dunad and Dalriada narratives for the new exhibition. Finally, in 2017, we were awarded 3.2 million from the National Heritage Lottery Fund. There were conditions that took us nearly 2 years to discharge, unfortunately, but eventually so this is for a project that's now grown to be in 7.2 million. Eventually in 2009, we were able to really get moving on the delivery phase, but we were having some challenges around acquiring land from the Church of Scotland. I won't bore you with the details, but essentially we were in a really tricky place about acquiring land to create an overflow car park. And with an extraordinary act of generosity, Ewan resolved that problem by buying a church, which he has now allowed us to use for storage during the construction phase of our project. There'll be another Blue Skies meeting, no doubt, to decide what happens next. So of course everything was going very well for us. Then for everybody else, the massive impact that COVID has had has not quite squashed us. Our timing has changed, our costs have risen a bit, but we're hoping that our major funders will cover that because they're due to COVID. So we have raised the pretty much 7 million. We're still waiting to hear from our major funders. And COVID restrictions dependent, we're actually ready to start on site in the spring of 2021. As I say, we're out of the building, almost in temporary accommodation. We're still fundraising, so if anyone wants a plaque, they're still available. And I know there's 1 or 2 trustees on this call, so on this seminar. So I have to say that, otherwise I'll get told off. So just to conclude, then, as we all know, history is a continual process of making and remaking. And Kilmartin Museum is entering a new and exciting phase in its existence, but this, at the moment, really only exists in our minds. But it's the same process that Kilmartin's prehistoric inhabitants undertook, building on the past and looking to the future. For us, that's when the new museum opens, and that will hopefully be in 2023. And when it does, I'm absolutely certain that you'll be able to see Ewan's unique influence threaded throughout the whole experience. And I do hope that you'll all come and visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Completely fascinating to hear about that. You know these things are happening, but it's nice to have it all kind of laid out like that. So I'm sure everyone else thought that was a very informative and also, really thoughtful the way you stitched Ewan into the narrative. Can I think we could maybe entertain a question or two. I think we'll have to do it via the chat. So if people have any questions they're bursting to put to Sharon, we'll create a bit of time at the end as well, but I'll just leave that hanging for a minute. I hope Neil is more or less poised. I have a couple of things to say about him as well before we kick off. Sharon, I think they're going to save their questions for later, okay? But anyway, thanks very much, and don't go away. Now, our next speaker is Niall Sharples. He's a Glasgow graduate, and he's one of these people who has been in my consciousness as a Scottish archaeologist since 4 decades. And initially I met him after he'd graduated. He was one of this merry band of excavators at the Artifact Research Unit, which is part of the National Museum at the time. And but they spent all their time, it seemed, in Orkney, in the Western Isles, digging stuff. And this obviously was ideal training for his next appointment, which was to dig Maiden Castle in Dorset. So from the Western Isles and the Northern Isles to Wessex was an easy jump for Neil. And he did this in the context of a kind of showcase excavation, which was done as part of or kind of prompted by the World Archaeology Congress, which was held in Southampton. And then having made a success of that, he returned to Historic Scotland for some enforced sitting out of fieldwork for a while, and then eventually was hired by Cardiff University, where he has been ever since. In 2012, he became professor, Niall. And this is based on an absolutely colossal amount of fieldwork. You know, one of the most substantive published fieldwork records of an academic archaeologist that I can think of. I particularly want to draw attention to the work he's done really since he was in Cardiff. You know, first 10 years he was there. And this focused in South Uist, and he, and particularly he has made a huge contribution to understanding the nature of the early medieval, early historic and Norse settlement through his excavations at Bornais. And in the context of this evening's seminar, I think we might draw attention to maybe not one of Niall's key contributions, at least in terms of his personal CV, but for everyone else, we have to be really grateful for Niall for getting Ewan back into the field. You know, that was when Ewan started going back to do field work, and you could really see the benefit of these seasons at South Uist. You could see it on his face. You could see it in all these photographs that started appearing stuck to the wall of his office, you know, and they were all jolly, you know, photos. Anyway, so for many of you, you won't be able to imagine Ewan as somebody who's not doing field work. This is a hard thing to imagine once you've worked with him. But we have to be really grateful for Niall for reigniting Ewan's fieldwork motor, because there's been so many of us who've benefited from the opportunity to work with him. Now, one of the things about Niall is, although he's spent, you know, quite a lot of his career and all his academic outside of Scotland, he's been really active in the archaeology of Scotland, in debating the archaeology of Scotland, and in doing the core work of Scottish archaeology. He helped edit the Audrey Henshaw Festschrift, for instance. He's been very critical, you know, offered critical views about archaeology after the war in the nationalism volume. And so he's never one to skirt controversy. And I think that comes across very clearly in the title of this evening's talk. When did the Outer Hebrides become Gaelic and Scottish? So that seems like an extremely challenging title, and very excited to hear what you have to say about that, Niall.
It's a very stupid title, I have to say. I don't know what was in my brain when I thought of that title. I must have been extremely sick from COVID, but hadn't been fully diagnosed at that time, I think. So I apologize for that confusing title, but if it's any relief to you, it confuses me as much as it confuses you. So what am I going to be talking about? Let's see if I can get this thing working. Oh, it's being slow. Oh, there we go. Oh, too far. Right. Okay, so the purpose of tonight's lecture is to discuss the transition from the Norse to Scottish control of the Western Isles, and to look at this from an archaeological perspective, using the recent results from the excavations at Bornais and to a lesser extent Cille Pheadair. Both these excavations have recently been fully published, and the slim volumes are now available in all good bookshops. I did actually see a copy of the Bornais Volume 3 for sale in what used to be Thins in Edinburgh this summer, and as I resisted the temptation to immediately buy it, it will probably still be there when they finally reopened in 2024 after the 10th wave of COVID has killed us all off. So it's all available now. My desire to talk about this period of transition is stimulated by two factors. First is my belief that there is a general neglect of archaeological interest in this transition period. And second is the newfound ability to talk with historical precision about the period due to the recent revolution in radiocarbon dating. When I talk about neglect, what I really mean is that there is an over-enthusiastic interest in the archaeology of the Viking colonization of the North Atlantic, which is not balanced by an interest in an understanding of its ending. This is a rather strange approach, as the archaeological evidence for the colonisation of the islands is often problematic. The number of sites which date to the 9th century or 10th century is minimal, and often the evidence for this colonisation period lies at the base of a long sequence of later deposits. And it can be very poorly preserved and very difficult to access. This was certainly the case at Bornais, where the early 10th century house lay below 2 complete houses and over a metre of stratified infilling and floor layers. We only managed to expose this at the end after 8 seasons of excavation, and only a very small area was ever excavated. Similarly, the underlying pictures of the Iron Age deposit saw only a tiny bit of keyhole excavation. Nevertheless, there is still a lot of pressure to fully integrate this material in all of its minute detail, and I have been encouraged to give papers on this material at several conferences on the Norse colonisation of the North Atlantic. No one has ever asked me to speak at a conference about the Scottish colonisation of the Western Isles, or indeed at any conference on the archaeology of medieval Scotland. It seems that the archaeology of the Western Isles is thought of as not relevant to our understanding of medieval Scotland at all. This neglect is despite this period being of considerable historical importance. It is less than 50 years after the purchase of the Western Isles that the Wars of Independence begin, and the magnates of the Western Isles played a significant part in that war. The sites at Bornais and Cille Pheadair were occupied throughout this period of transition and clearly tell us a lot about the transition of a Norse colony into an admittedly semi-detached province of Scotland, but a province of Scotland nevertheless. The contribution that archaeology could make to these historical discussions could have been dismissed as tenuous, as the ability to place buildings and phases and artifacts in well-defined chronological periods is generally problematic, and much of our chronology has been broad brushed to say the least. However, recent developments in radiocarbon dating have changed things considerably. The use of Bayesian statistics to analyse radiocarbon dates has enhanced the precision of the technique considerably, and it is now possible to achieve tight control over the chronology of the archaeological evidence. I am not going to explain the nature of Bayesian statistics to you, you'll be glad to hear, but the key to improving the precision of the dates is the ability to factor in a priori knowledge of the relative chronology of the samples dated. If you know one sample is earlier than another because of the site stratigraphy, then this will affect how you assess and determine the date of that sample. This is very important for the sites we have excavated in the Western Isles, as both Bornais and Cille Pheadair are exceptionally well stratified settlements, and the samples come from long sequences which have clear stratigraphic relationships. The quality was also improved by the excellent preservation conditions, the sampling strategies, and the wide range of organic material that could be dated. We were normally only dealing with material that we could be certain had not been moved around after death. And due to Historic Environment Scotland's generosity, we have a very large number of radiocarbon dates from all the settlement mounds excavated, and we are able to speak with confidence of the chronological development of the site. We can identify when the different houses were constructed and abandoned, how long they were occupied, the length of the gaps in the occupation, and when the settlements were abandoned. The chronologies are not perfect, they still have to be critically assessed, but they are a significant improvement on what came before, and mean that we are not guessing about the relationship between archaeology and history. A good illustration of the kind of precision I am talking about is the date of House 3 at Bornais. This is a very interesting structure and plays a key part in the development of the settlement. It is the third, it's this red house here, the third of a sequence of 3 houses that are built on this large mound, Mound 2. These houses are much larger than the normal houses on the other settlement mounds, and they clearly indicate that this was the location of a high status family who acted as the central focus for this unusually large settlement. So important family living in a very important settlement. The two previous houses were classic bow-walled longhouses that clearly indicate the Scandinavian allegiance of the occupants, even at the end of the 11th century when the second house was constructed. House 3, however, is a completely different type of house. It has playing card proportions with very straight walls and sharp corners, and probably was built with a thick turf cladding around the timber frame. It has a distinct entrance passage. Where is that cursor gone? Oops, sorry. Over here. And at the meeting of the entrance passage and the house, there's a very distinct sill with these two stones, upright stones, making it a very distinct entry point where you step over the sill to get into the house. However, one continuity is the actual location of the entrance. The position of the entrance up at the end of this long side is actually very similar to the position of the entrances in these earlier bow-walled longhouses. This is a very distinctive feature of these houses. House 3 has several discrete, well, it's got three floors, different floors, and it's got within each of the floors, they've got very distinct hearths. And as you move from the earliest to the latest hearth, this general drift is a movement north. The original large hearth was down here at the center of the sort of southern inside portion of the house, but in the middle phase it moves up, and then in the final phase, the main hearth area is around here and is opposite the entrance to the house. And this seems to be a very distinct movement. The position of the sort of subsidiary hearth, however, suggests that we might be talking about this house being divided up into rooms, perhaps three separate rooms in this big house. This is a noticeable difference from the earlier longhouses. They were divided longitudinally into sort of three separate areas, with the main sort of thoroughfare covered in ashes from repeatedly created hearths that all ran down the center of this house. It's a much longer, thinner house, quite a different sort of sense of space. So these changes are therefore quite dramatic and suggest a major change in the spatial organization of the most important household that sat at the center of the settlement. So it would have been of considerable significance. The question therefore arises over when this change occurs, and fortunately for House 3, this change is very well documented. The construction of House 3 is dated by two samples. Well, we've got lots of samples, let's not go through them all. All of these radiocarbon dates here come from the occupation of this house, and they give a very accurate chronology for its use, particularly as we've got preceding dates which provide nice determines whatever quem that occurs before. The house was probably built between AD 1260 and 1280, and there's a 57.6% chance it was constructed after AD 1266. And I got to thank Pete Marshall for the precision of this analysis. He's done all our Bayesian analysis, and all the dates I refer to have come from Pete's work. It was built 110 to 170 years after House 2 was abandoned, when there was apparently no high status residence at Bornais, or at least on Mound 2. House 3 was occupied for probably 25 to 75 years, and this was sufficient time for it to have had these three major episodes of reflooring. This house therefore appears to have been constructed around the time the islands were formally annexed by the Scottish kings, and it may indeed represent the arrival on the island of a new overlord imposing a new Scottish style of building onto the island landscape. However, I think this would be a very simplistic reading of the archaeology and the history, and we need to be a lot more subtle in our analysis of this structure before we leap to any conclusions. So let us briefly précis the history. And I have to admit to not being a historian, despite the fact that I did do 2 years of history, Scottish history at Glasgow University. I claim no specialist skills. In fact, I think it was a miracle that they let me get through those 2 years. It's all based on my secondary reading of the books written about this period. And I'm just going to précis some of the key points. We know, or some people think they know, that by the early 13th century, the island was incorporated into the lordship of Garmorin under the sons of Ruari, a descendant of Somerled. So this afternoon, I did read one of the historians who actually challenged this. So this is debatable, but some of the historians are fairly secure in their belief that this area was taken over early in the 13th century by the MacCruries, who are kin of Somerled. The MacCruries, however, despite being kin of Somerled, were strongly allied with the Norwegian kings, and Dugald MacCrury is regarded as recorded as visiting Bergen in the middle of the 13th century, several times indeed. He seems to have been a repeated visitor to Bergen, and so had very close links with Norway. When King Haakon led his fleet across to Scotland in 1263, he was fully supported by his MacCrory subjects, who sailed with him down to the Clyde, and the inconclusive end to this campaign that is called the Battle of Largs. The death of Haakon and the purchase of the islands by Alexander III does not appear to have lessened MacCrory connections with Norway. And Dugald was all for carrying on the struggle against the Scottish king in 1266. But fortunately, he died in 1268. And nevertheless, his connections with Norway continued because one of his sons appears to have lived on in Norway and to become an earl there. Nevertheless, despite these Norwegian connections, the MacCruries retain control of the lordship of Garmorin, and they retain control of the island of South Uist. They eventually emerged from the Wars of Independence in relatively good standing by a late switch to the winning side of the Bruce. However, this was somewhat a Pyrrhic victory, as the chief appears to have died fighting with Edward Bruce in Ireland in AD 1318. The real winners that arise from the Wars of Independence are the MacDonalds of Islay, and in 1346, John of Islay inherited the lordship of Garmorin by marrying Amy MacCrory after the murder of her brother by the Earl of Ross. Hold on, I don't think I was supposed to move there. We therefore appear to have a relatively stable overlordship of the island by a hybrid Gaelic Norse family, the MacCruries, throughout the 13th and early 14th century. A family who were happy to express their fealty to both the Norwegian king and the Scottish kings, and that doesn't seem to be an unusual situation in the islands of the West. Were the MacCruries Gaelic or Norse speakers, I suspect they moved easily between both languages as and when it suited them. The local population occupying the other mounds at Bornais were, I suspect, speaking Norse at this time, as the place name evidence implies a complete domination of this language on these islands after the colonisation. There may have been a few Gaelic speakers amongst the community, wives imported from the densely colonised lands to the south and east, perhaps, and there may even have been individuals descended from the enslaved islanders that kept alive the old tongue for secret subversive communications. However, on a day-to-day basis, I think most people, nearly all people on the island, were speaking Norse. How does this help us understand the archaeology? Well, we have to begin by asking if the distinctive shape and form of House 3 is an alien imposition that indicates the arrival of a Scottish archaeology, as I originally primitively presented. In actual fact, it seems likely that it's more complicated than that. If we look at construction the sequence of nature of the domestic space occurs well new foundation at roughly the same time as Bornais, and the initial form of the buildings are fairly substantial, typical Viking longhouses. But the site never becomes an important settlement. It never develops other buildings. It always seems to be a fairly simple, independent farm throughout its existence. The basic trajectory of the development of this farm is a gradual reduction in the main living space by the creation of a small domestic space associated with contemporary ancillary buildings, which for some reason I've not drawn on these plans. The final phase building is a rectangular structure with a simple playing card shape. That's this building here. Playing card proportions that are characteristic of House 3, though this building is much smaller. This building unusually has two entrances, one of which is a very long passageway, but otherwise it's a fairly classic late building. The interior is dominated by a long hearth which covers the centre of the building and is reminiscent of the hearths in the longhouses rather than those circular splodges of ash that we see in House 3. This house was built between AD 1160 and 1185, roughly 100 years before the Scottish takeover of the island. It clearly demonstrates that some of the characteristic features of the late houses were present much earlier than the traditional date. However, it's still not clear what this means. The historical sources open up the possibility that Somerled already controlled the islands by the middle of the 12th century, so we could claim Scottish influence on the architecture developing at this early date. But perhaps we are looking at this in completely the wrong fashion. It is almost certainly wrong to think of Somerled and his descendants as either Scottish or Norse, as it is, and it's as wrong to attribute the change in the architecture as indicating cultural influence of one form or another. We shouldn't be looking at these houses as cultural markers. They are functioning buildings. I would prefer to see the architecture gradually evolving in its own unique fashion to create a distinctive and uniquely Hebridean vernacular, which owes its origin to the Norse longhouse, but is very different in its final form. By the later 14th century, the vernacular architecture has reached its apogee in the final house built on one of the other settlement mounds at Bornais, Mound 3. This is an 8 metre long by 4 metre wide house with playing card proportions that are very similar to those of the main high status House 3. It has turf walls and the typical entrance that we have seen in the previous houses. Most importantly, it has a small curved hearth located directly opposite the entrance. It is accompanied by ancillary structures, which include this corn drying kiln, which forms a useful progenitor for the distinctive used corn drying kilns of the historical period. So this essentially creates the prototypes for what becomes a classic crofting settlement that we see on South Uist up until the early 20th century. There are some modifications and some minor changes, but essentially the prototype is in this building, which evolves in the 12th century at the sequence in Cille Pheadair. So that's the sort of architecture, which is the core of this lecture. I'm now going to go and look at some of the other evidence to see what other things changed. And I'll sort of rush through this stuff as it's, well, I'll just rush through it as we haven't got a lot of time. Material culture. Well, one of the most important changes in material culture is actually the overall decline in the quantities of material that are being discarded. And this is very clear in these high status houses in Mound 2. The House 2 bow-shaped longhouse was absolutely stacked full of treasure. It was stuffed full of really, really nice, interesting finds. In contrast, the assemblages from House 3 were extremely scrappy and consisted of bone points, broken bits of iron tools, and nothing of any great significance. So there's a major decline in material culture, or perhaps more importantly, a major decline in the way material culture is disposed of. There's no longer a culture of conspicuous consumption of objects associated with the use of the houses. A couple of the most important object types are the pins and the combs, and we have quite a lot of these, and again they follow the same pattern. There's a decline from the Middle Norse period to the later Norse period, which is roughly the period, the periods on either side of the 1266. Roughly, there's a little bit of difference. A lot of the pins are quite interesting. We've got a lot of bone pins and some very nice copper alloy pins. The copper alloy pins are simple stick pins, and they show the allegiance of the community with the Irish Sea province, because these are very distinctly Irish type stick pins, which are almost certainly actually being produced in one of the towns like Dublin or Waterford. So very clear affiliations, and they continue on into the later period. So they don't disappear, and they carry on from the Middle to the Late Norse. Similarly, the bone pins, won't say much about these, but there are some very distinctive Norse types which decline. These sort of big pig-shaped fibula pins are probably the most classic example. They do seem to decline significantly, but a lot of these kind of nice elaborate pins with these elaborately carved heads, these are significant in the later period. Combs. Now, combs are different. In the middle period, our combs are culturally affiliated with the Irish Sea province. They're very distinct Irish type combs. When we move into the later period, there is a marked cultural change. In the middle of the 13th century, we start to see the re-emergence of double-sided combs in quite large numbers. And prior to that, we were very heavily concentrated on single-sided combs. We also see the appearance of some of these, these are Norwegian imports. These are the classic fishtail combs, which have been discussed by many archaeologists, and these almost certainly come from some of the towns on the west coast of Norway. So these are very definitely being imported. The continued significance of these combs is, however, is also important. Just the fact that we're still using composite antler combs in the 13th and probably the 14th century, because these combs have largely been abandoned further south in Britain. Most of the major urban centres in southern Britain are using these kind of things, single-sided, boxwood or horn combs. And we've got one possible fragment of something that might have been an attempt to make one of these out of antler, but it's just a little fragment. But this is what the fashionable southerners are using, not these ancient composite combs. The significance of these combs is emphasized by the presence of a very nice comb making workshop on Mound 2A, which is another one of the peripheral mounds at Bornais. This workshop produced hundreds and hundreds of pieces of antler comb making debris, and it's clearly producing double-sided combs. This is a blank broken in production for a double-sided comb, and the double-sided combs are probably what is passing for a Hebridean imitation of these fishtail combs that are imported from Norway. This could actually be a Norwegian comb maker appearing at Bornais and starting to produce combs, and they're that distinctive. The date of that workshop is, again, it's right on this period of transition. What does Pete say? He says, comb maker's workshop. Oh, you're in my way. I can't actually read it. Basically, it's built about 12. It's basically built just before 1266, but the use actually spans the 1266 period. It could have been used and abandoned before the transition, or it could be used immediately after the transition, but it's occurring around that time, and it could well be related to what's his name, Dougal's trips to Bergen, where he could have picked up a comb maker that would be prepared to come over to work at a settlement in the Western Isles. So again, there's an interesting historical link there, but it does show the Norwegians' affiliations of these people at that time. There are pottery changes as well. We see in this late Norse period the abandonment of the use of these. These are the distinct Norse platters, a sort of cultural signifier of Norse settlement on the Western Isles, if ever there was. And these disappear in this late Norse period. And we see the emergence of a much finer, not replacing these obviously, but replacing the sort of crude cooking pots that the Norse people were using, a sort of much finer and everted rim type of pottery, which is interestingly very like Iron Age pottery. If you drop some of these sherds in an Iron Age assemblage, a Middle Iron Age assemblage from the Western Isles, you could probably lose it quite happily. Now, the interesting thing is that these changes don't appear to occur at the transition. They appear to occur slightly later. They actually occur during the use of House 3. They actually occur, the primary floor of House 3 has evidence for the use of platterware, doesn't have many everted rims, but the secondary use, platter's gone, completely absent from the secondary use, and everted rims kick in at this period. So there's a sort of interesting delayed transition in the way pottery has been used. But the disappearance of platter must be seen as something quite significant, because this is associated with cooking of flatbreads, a very distinctive foodstuff, and which has very clear Scandinavian Norse connotations. So that's quite interesting. There's nothing really much to say about the animal bones. The economy does not appear to change significantly as we move from the middle to the late Norse period. There's a decline in pig and red deer consumption. That seems to be consistent, but the variations in cattle and sheep are just reflecting sort of taxonomic changes and disposal patterns at the site rather than anything of great significance. Fishbone, again, a major foodstuff in this period. The density of fishbone increases over time, but it's not an abrupt rise, it's a gradual increase over time. It's still, the assemblage is dominated by herring. There's huge quantities of herring bones are being found. It's the proportions of herring. There are slightly more species appearing in the final phases. So that's what these pie charts indicate. The non-green bit increases, but it's a very slight increase. There's a bit of diversity coming into the fish diet, but it's not greatly significant, I would think. Okay, so conclusion. To conclude, I think the event of 1266 was probably not the dramatic change in the island story that it could have been. The Norse society of the Outer Hebrides was gradually evolving in its own idiosyncratic manner. The conspicuous consumption of material wealth that was such a feature of the deposits in the bow-walled longhouses seemed to be regarded as inappropriate, and it declines, disappears. Perhaps there was less portable wealth available, as raiding in southern Scotland and Ireland might have been declining as well. The buildings were being transformed, and at the lower end of the social spectrum, a simple form of short rectangular house with associated ancillary structures was emerging that would serve the islanders up into the early 20th century. The economy seems to have been relatively unchanging, and the impression is of a varied diet amply provided with meat from cattle, sheep, fish in abundance, and a variety of cereal grains. I didn't mention the cereal grains when I went through it, but there's, again, no obvious change in the cereals being produced or used. There is no evidence for a developing economic crisis, and yet something dramatic was happening, as we know that the settlements were being abandoned. Cille Pheadair was abandoned in the 13th century. Bornais Mound 2 and 2A were abandoned at the end of the 14th century, and Bornais Mound 3 was abandoned in the middle of the 15th century. This movement away from the Macher Plain, occupied since the Bronze Age, was systematic across the island, and though it may never have been total, it does represent a significant disruption to the Norse settlement pattern and may coincide with a massive reduction of the population of the island. The reasons for this move are unclear and would need another lecture to explore, but I would suggest that this is the kind of disruption that may provide an opportunity for Gaelic to become the dominant language on the islands. I would like to close this talk by reconsidering the construction of House 3. I have perhaps diminished the significance of this house and the events of 1266 a bit too much. The house itself might not have represented a major cultural transformation imposed on an ancient Scandinavian influenced landscape, but its construction nevertheless was a significant event. There had been no high status residence on Mound 2 for 150 years, roughly, and yet it was clearly acknowledged and understood that this was the appropriate location to build this house. Its construction clearly conformed to previous traditions of succession by being crafted to create a physical overlap with the earlier high status house wall. This isn't an accident. This building of this wall on top of the end wall of House 2 is deliberate and coincides with and it's the kind of thing that went on throughout the construction phases that we see on these houses. Here you can see House 1, and the entrance to the end of House 1 is used to mark the entrance to House 2. This kind of juxtaposition of early agriculture and late agriculture, early architecture and late architecture is really important to these people. So the construction clearly it clearly creates a physical link as well as emphasizing a genealogical link with the previous inhabitants. That should say clearly creates a physical link, but almost certainly is deliberately emphasizing a genealogical link with the previous inhabitants. This event does seem to be closely related to the date of 1266, and it is possible that the circumstances around the event encouraged the McCrorys to take physical possession of their land in the Uists and establish a permanent presence on the island. There are no settlements on the island of the size and complexity of Bornais at this time, and it seems quite likely that a high-status McCrory family member would be the principal occupant of Mound 2 in the late 13th century. The abandonment of the house in the early 14th century could be due to the construction of Bob Castle in Benbecula, which is traditionally linked with Amy McCrory, the last of the line. Thank you. I shall stop there. Stop share.
Thank you very much, Neil. I don't know if you will have done much for your sales there. I think you probably have summarized things so effectively that nobody will feel the need to read your books now. But we appreciate it. So thank you very much. Now there's a so we've got quite a few people here. We've got you've thrown out some very provocative things. There are a few questions which are now starting to show up on the chat.
Do I have to read them?
I'll try to fish them out for you because they're in. So you you just need to think and answer.
Okay.
And can I also invite people to if they wish to kind of probe Sharon about what she was talking about the way this museum's coming together, you know, we can take questions on both. So there's a couple of easy questions. I'll start with the easy one. What fuel? That was like that's fairly straightforward, not too open-ended.
Peat.
Peat. Okay.
Yeah, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of peat, with a little bit of charcoal, with a little bit of burnt wood here and there.
Okay. One of the other questions which it occurred to me was, is the change in house form, could you link that to availability of timber? Could
well, timber, how the timber roof is, how the roofs are timbered, whatever, is important. I suspect at this time, and probably really from the Norse period onwards, they were importing timber. In our early house that we got on Bornais Mound 1, which is a late Iron Age house, or the 5th to 6th centuries, the roof is completely made from driftwood. And they're obviously using large quantities of driftwood in roofing of these earlier structures. But by the time you get to the Norse period, I suspect it wouldn't be a problem for them to import timber and even ship it across from Scotland, Scottish mainland or further afield. And certainly by the time of the Lordship of Garmoren, I think one of the reasons for linking the mainland and the islands is supposed to be the fact that the mainlands can supply the timber for the island settlements. I don't know where I read that, but I'm sure I read it somewhere.
Well, there's a lot of oak, Sunert and so on.
Yeah.
The Chiron backdrop. There's a couple. So now those are the easy questions.
Now the googly.
Yeah. So I mean. So one of them, Ian McKellar, is wondering to what extent you can use linguistic evidence to try to unravel this, and you know, in terms of vocabulary and names and so on. And obviously, there's been a really important work recently on South Uist by Sophie Edelman and colleagues at Glasgow. I don't know whether that's kind of falls into your radar.
No, I haven't picked up on that. I'm not a linguistically. I am a linguistically challenged archaeologist, and it's taken me enough of my energy to get those big volumes out and just understanding the archaeology. So I don't have the skill set, and I don't have the ability to develop the skill set to really interrogate the linguistic arguments. So I wouldn't be the right person to do that, frankly, as I'm never going to be able to learn that.
It sounds to me like there's a room for a discussion with those folk.
Yeah, I'm up for a discussion, and I'm happy to put in my 2 pennies worth about the archaeology. But yeah, I'm more than up for that.
There's another question which came up, which is potentially kind of open-ended here, and I don't know what you're thinking about. Is maybe you were alluding to it at the very end, but there's a question. I can't remember who's by. It's by David Newman. Is there any thinking about why there are so few house remains from 1300 to 1750?
Well, be careful when you say too few house remains, because frankly, not a lot of people are looking, and you know, there could be a lot out there which are just not being found, not known about. I could get you any number of house remains from the 12th to 14th century. You know, there are many Viking sites that have been identified by Mark Parker Pearson's Macher survey. We could go across them and find them very easily. As soon as people move off the Macher onto the Blacklands, it becomes much more problematic identifying the settlements, and particularly as the final houses, that house 3 is probably what they're living on. That's something like the house on Mound 3, not the big house 3, the house on Mound 3, the little small one I showed you. All that would survive of that is a single line of stones, the inner curb, which forms a sort of foundation for a timber frame for the internal structure. That's a totally turf-walled house. So if you have that on the Blacklands, it would be very difficult to spot, even if it survived perfectly. And the chances in those areas where it's not getting covered over with sand routinely and regularly accumulating over it, you know, these sites would easily be damaged, cultivated, completely destroyed. Mike Parker Pearson did excavate 15th, 16th, 17th century, I can't remember exactly what date, I think it was 15th, 16th century site, which is probably the successor to Bornais on the adjacent areas of the Blackland. And the houses were literally single lines of stones. And there was no accumulation of the middens. All of that organic material that survives on the Macher disappears. It's taken off and put in the fields probably, but it's also just, it just doesn't survive in these acidic, very violently erosive environments. So there almost certainly are a lot of houses there, but they're very badly damaged and very poorly preserved. There are some later settlements on the Macher. There's about 3 on South Uist, which we can say probably have continuity to the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And if you really want to, I mean, you could develop a very good reason for digging those sites, because they would give you the full sequence right up to the clearance period. Boisdale is one area where this historically marked settlement on the bold map of 1707, and the mounds are there, plain to see, and easy to excavate. So you could excavate on those sites and find out what the house forms were like, and also get the economic evidence, which would be compatible with the economic evidence from our sites.
Okay, well, that's a little bit of homework then for David to get on with. There's a couple other questions, but I want to make sure we have time to come back to Sharon. So I just want to kind of there's a question by David Brer, a comment question about talking about decline. I'm not quite sure whether he's positive or negative about that, but he asks, does the lack of material culture in House 3 imply a cleaner culture rather than a poorer one?
Well, that's what I was trying to allude to, the fact that we shouldn't say that these people are poorer, because we don't know that they don't have other material that's circulating within this community. I think it's likely that they're poorer, but I wouldn't go all the way. And I think it is the Norse people who are occupying House 2 were quite happy to chuck away complete pins and let them fall adjacent to them in the house and just lie there and be covered over by later house floors. So that they do have this very disposable attitude to their artifacts, and you can see that throughout, and that certainly doesn't seem to be the case later on. So it could be a cultural moray, that has some kind of social significance. It could simply reflect the fact that they didn't have as much, and so they were less likely to let it accidentally get thrown away. You know, you pays your money, you takes your choice. But I'm not removing one option from the discussion. Okay,
thanks very much. There's another comment about scientific work on copper in your copper alloy pins. I don't know whether you did any source work, but
we did analysis. It's the copper alloys are too mixed. That Ewan could probably come in here actually, because he's an expert on this kind of work. But my specialist told me that the material is too mixed to easily distinguish the sources.
Okay.
There are some subtle differences which suggested certain consistencies. There's a possibility you could do further research that would pick that up. But remember, we're dealing with alloys of mixed materials that have been sort of chuntering around probably for quite some time, being remixed and remixed and remixed. They're not pure
thank you.
Alloys.
That's great. Sharon, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the kind of, your new museum is going to be bigger. What are the range of the themes that you're going to look at? Is it still going to be predominantly about the prehistory and the early historic period, or what are the kind of aspirations in terms of the interpretation strategy?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work and a lot of kind of workshops on what should the story be, and I think what we've decided to settle on is to keep coming back to what is Kilmartin's kind of USP, if you like, is how the kind of interpretive specialists like to call it. So we are trying very much to have a big focus on the particularly on the early Bronze Age and the Chalcolithic period, because that's what and on the later Neolithic and Rock Art, because those are the things that are kind of unique and interesting about Kilmartin. Obviously Dynad plays a big role in that, so it presents a lot of challenges, because obviously we've got periods where we have to, where the visitor sort of expectation is to get a kind of whole story, and we don't have very much evidence, say, for the Iron Age. And obviously there's a lot of people who are interested in the later periods of history of Kilmartin, when we can't really cover that because they will have a bigger building. We're not going to have that much extra space. So I think where we also, when we were looking at all these questions, is also to be guided by our collections. And as I mentioned, when the museum first opened, we didn't have very many artifacts in the collections, and a lot of the major sites in Kilmartin were excavated before the museum opened, and so the artifacts from those museums had gone into museums like the National Museum of Scotland and the British Museum and Glasgow museums as well. So although we will be borrowing, hopefully, some of the star artifacts back for the exhibition, we did also want to make sure we featured many of our own collections. And of course that then gives us some issues, because we've got things like the Cole hoard, which was found in 2012, which is from the Isle of Cole. But we were discussing that the other day. We have to keep justifying, why are we displaying that? And we kind of said it's such an important hoard that if we don't display it, we shouldn't have it. Someone else should. So there's quite a lot of agonising, I should say, about what our stories and messages are. But we're kind of, and we're not quite there with it. But those are the sort of guiding principles we're working with. Is kind of, is it about Kilmartin? Is Kilmartin the best place to tell that story? And does it, do the collections tell that story? And but also trying to integrate the monuments with it as well, which is an interesting challenge.
It sounds interesting. It sounds like maybe one of the things you'll be doing is having areas for temporary displays or kind of new discoveries, that sort of thing, so to allow a bit of dynamic or a bit of change to be introduced.
Yeah, we certainly will. We've got space for temporary exhibition galleries as well. So yeah, we will certainly be doing that. We've got lots of ideas for exhibitions, and we have material from, say, Colonsay. We've got Norse material from Colonsay that we'd like to be able to put on a little exhibition about, for example. So yeah, we certainly will be doing that.
There's a couple of other questions which have now popped up here. A couple are fairly straightforward, hopefully easy ones for you. Somebody's asking for a new guidebook. That's like in the pipeline once you've got the museum built, but
no, we've got a new guidebook in the pipeline for when the new museum opens, actually. So not to put ourselves under any pressure. So yeah, we are phasing out Footsteps of Things book and producing a new one. So yeah, we have that in the pipeline.
And somebody else is asking about whether you're going to repeat Half-Life.
Oh, well, that was an experience. I think it's certainly Sorry, Stephen.
This person found it very memorable.
Yeah, it was an incredibly memorable experience, and it was the theatre production. So it was NVA and National Theatre of Scotland project, which featured an outdoor theatre experience for those people who don't know, and lots of installations at monuments around the Glen. And it brought a hugely diverse audience, a completely different audience were introduced to the archaeology of Kilmartin, I think, and it was a very amazing experience. I think certainly the principle of kind of land art and installations around archaeological sites, we certainly would like to repeat. I think the NVA is no longer a functioning company anymore, which is very sad. But certainly, if it was, it would be great to work with them again. I should also say that Angus Farker, who was the creative director of NVA, I think is really probably responsible for the title of Footsteps of Things as well. So I think in discussions with him, we came up with that title.
There's Sharon, there's a couple more questions which are getting a bit technical, and I think we're kind of running to the end of our time. So I'll direct you to them, and maybe you'll be able to respond directly to the people involved about how much you're contributing to the local economy. And also there's a very open-ended one about Kilmartin's position in Western Europe and the Atlantic seaboard, which is, I think, takes us into a new zone for discussion. I think we need to draw this a very exciting seminar to a close. Interesting contrast, really highlights the range of stuff that Dr. Campbell engages in and his positive contributions on the mainland and in the Isles. I think at that point, I'd just like to, maybe we can all do our virtual clap and thank Niall and Sharon for their very stimulating talks. And well, thanks very much, guys. It was great.